The 18th of April, 1943. The South Pacific sky looks calm from far away, just a wide blue lid stretched over dark water and scattered islands. But down at wavetop level, 18 American fighters are skimming the ocean so low that the spray seems close enough to taste. Engines thrum with a steady, disciplined violence. No radio chatter, no flares, no second chances. They are not looking for a fleet. They are not hunting a convoy. They are hunting one man. Somewhere ahead, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Japan's most famous naval commander, has climbed into a twin-engine bomber for what is supposed to be a routine inspection tour. It is scheduled. It is timed. It is protected. And yet, the Americans are already waiting in the air. Not because they guessed, but because they knew. So here is the question that hangs over this mission like a shadow. If war is chaos, how did the United States arrange a mid-air execution with the precision of an appointment? And what did it cost them to do it? By early 1943, the Pacific War had shifted into a grinding contest of endurance and intelligence. The United States had stopped the Japanese advance at Midway and was locked into brutal attrition across the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal, New Georgia, Bougainville, names that sounded like distant geography, until they became shorthand for blood, disease, mud, and exhaustion. In Tokyo and in the field, Yamamoto remained a symbol of Japanese naval power. He had been the strategic brain behind the opening blow at Pearl Harbor. He was also, paradoxically, a realist, a man who understood American industrial strength and had warned that Japan could win early victories but might not win a long war. His reputation among allies and enemies alike was that of a cold, capable professional, and that reputation mattered. In wartime, reputation becomes a kind of weapon. A commander's name can steady morale, intimidate opponents, and impose discipline on subordinates. Yamamoto's name did all three. That is why, when U.S. signals intelligence cracked something extraordinary, a travel itinerary, the information landed like a live grenade on the desks of decision-makers. The Japanese Navy relied heavily on coded communications, including the JN-25 code system. American cryptanalysts and intelligence officers had spent years fighting a secret war of mathematics, pattern recognition, and painstaking inference, trying to turn meaningless strings of numbers into usable truth. By 1943, that effort had matured into an intelligence advantage capable of shaping operations. An intercepted message revealed that Yamamoto planned to fly from Rabaul, Japan's major base in the region, to inspect forward positions in the Solomons. The message included details that made it uniquely actionable: dates, times, and destinations. In other words, it did not merely imply his movement, it described it. This was not intelligence in the vague sense. It was a schedule, but a schedule creates a dilemma as much as an opportunity. If you act on it, you may win a spectacular tactical victory and a strategic psychological blow. But you also risk exposing that you can read the enemy's mail. If Japan realizes its codes are compromised, it will change them, and an intelligence advantage that took years to build can vanish overnight. So the Americans faced the problem that sits at the center of modern intelligence warfare. Do you spend your secret, or do you preserve it? At the higher levels, the discussion was not merely operational. It was political, strategic, and moral. Targeting an individual leader, especially one as prominent as Yamamoto, was different from sinking a ship because it was part of a fleet. This was deliberate selection of a person. In another context, it might resemble assassination. In wartime terms, it could be framed as lawful combat. Yamamoto was in uniform, traveling on military aircraft, within a war zone, directing military operations. Still, the optics and the precedent were not trivial. In the end, the decision was made. The opportunity was too valuable, and the target too significant. Now came the second problem. Even if you know where he will be, can you physically reach him? Yamamoto's route lay over vast distances of ocean and jungle-covered islands. American aircraft had to launch from distant bases, fly far beyond what would normally be safe, and arrive at the intercept point at exactly the right time, neither early risking fuel wastage and detection, nor late missing the target entirely. The mission required precision, not only in marksmanship, but in navigation and timing. The aircraft chosen was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a twin-engine fighter with long range, high speed, and the ability to carry additional fuel in drop tanks. In the Pacific, the P-38's range gave it a strategic reach other fighters often lacked. It was not simply a dogfighter. It was a weapon that could be delivered across distance. But long range is relative. This mission stretched the concept. The plan demanded a flight out to the intercept area and back with almost no margin for error. Pilots would have to manage fuel like accountants under gunfire, watching gauges as closely as they watched the horizon. The route itself was designed to reduce the chance of early warning. Rather than flying a direct line that might cross areas watched by Japanese observers, the P-38 seconds would take a longer path, staying low over the sea to avoid radar detection. At extremely low altitude, the ocean becomes both concealment and hazard. One mistake, one moment of disorientation, and the plane becomes a metal coffin that disappears without a trace. The strike package was arranged with two roles. A small number would be killers, positioned to attack the bombers. Others would act as top cover and engage the expected fighter escorts. Because the Japanese would not send Yamamoto unprotected, the Americans had to assume they would meet experienced pilots in Zero fighters. Everything about the mission was built on a single fragile principle: arrive at the exact minute. In the early hours, the P-38 seconds launched and began the long, silent transit. The fighters settled into the uncomfortable rhythm of low-level flight engines steady, wings inches from the sea, the world reduced to horizon line and instrument needles. The pilots had to trust their navigation and the intelligence behind it. There was no visual landmark for much of the route. The ocean offers no reassurance, only sameness. As they approached the planned intercept area near Bougainville, time tightened. The pilots began to climb, preparing for contact. This is where planning turns into reality. The moment when a mission that looked clean on paper becomes a situation filled with unknowns: weather, visibility, enemy deviation, mechanical failure, human error. And then, just as calculated, Japanese aircraft appeared. Two Mitsubishi G-4M bombers, known by the Allies as Betty, came into view, moving with the steady confidence of aircraft that believed they were on schedule and reasonably safe. Around them, fighter escort Zeros formed a protective screen. This was the moment everything was for. The American killers broke formation and went for the bombers. The escorts reacted immediately. The air snapped into chaos. Fighters diving, climbing, turning, tracers stitching the sky, engines screaming at full power. Here, the mission's cold logic met its human reality. A bomber is not a helpless target. It carries gunners, and it can absorb punishment while still flying. A fighter cannot afford a straight, predictable approach. The American pilots had to attack aggressively enough to kill quickly, but smartly enough to survive the defensive fire and the escorts. The engagement condensed into seconds of decision. AP-38 lines up, squeezes the trigger, feels the aircraft shudder as guns fire. The pilot watches for hits, not because he wants drama, but because he must know whether to commit again or break away. One Betty was hit hard. Smoke, then flame. The bomber began to lose altitude, its flight path turning into a dying arc. It went down into the jungle, violent, final, unrecoverable. Inside was Yamamoto. The other bomber also came under attack and was forced down, crashing into the sea. The escorts fought fiercely, but the Americans had designed the mission to focus on the bombers first. If you remove the principal, the rest of the fight becomes secondary. The entire interception, years of code-breaking, weeks of debate, days of planning, hours of flight, was decided in a short burst of aerial violence. Now came the third problem: get home. A successful long-range strike is not complete until the aircraft return. Fuel was low. Planes had flown at demanding altitudes and throttle settings. Some aircraft had maneuvered violently in combat, consuming precious reserves. Any damage could become fatal over open ocean. A pilot who survived the dogfight could still die from an empty tank miles from land. The surviving P-38 seconds turned back, retracing their route. The sea resumed its blank indifference. The adrenaline drained, leaving the pilots with the sober knowledge that they were still in danger until the wheels touched friendly ground. Back at base, the mission's outcome had to be handled with discipline. The intelligence community's biggest fear was not the enemy's grief, it was the enemy's realization. If Japan concluded that this was possible only through code compromise, it could change its systems. The U.S. had to craft a cover story that made the intercept seem like the result of reconnaissance or chance. That requirement shaped how the mission was discussed, and even how it was celebrated. Meanwhile, in Japan, the shock was immense. Yamamoto was not merely a commander, he was a national symbol. His death was a strategic wound. Yet the Japanese response was also controlled. News of his death was not immediately broadcast in full public detail. Wartime governments understand morale the way engineers understand structural integrity. You do not remove a supporting beam abruptly if you fear the whole structure will wobble. Eventually, Japan held a state funeral and elevated Yamamoto's death into a narrative of sacrifice and honor. The U.S., for its part, regarded the mission as a triumph, a proof that intelligence, planning, and reach could strike at the enemy's center of gravity. But the deeper question is whether the victory was as decisive as it appeared. Did killing Yamamoto change Japan's capacity to fight? Not in the way sinking a carrier changes a fleet. The Japanese Navy still had ships, pilots, and logistics, but leadership is a multiplier. A great commander can impose coherence, coordinate strategy, and inspire confidence. When such a figure is removed, an organization often becomes more cautious, more fragmented, or more politicized, especially in systems where internal rivalry already exists. Yamamoto's successor could still command, but he could not instantly inherit Yamamoto's authority, reputation, and strategic personality. And in war, personality matters. Some leaders take risks, others protect assets. Some insist on aggressive operations, others prioritize preservation. Over time, those tendencies shape the trajectory of campaigns. Operation Vengeance also reinforced something else: the rise of intelligence as a decisive battlefield. This was not simply an air mission. It was a demonstration that information could reach across distance and create a killing opportunity with near-clinical precision. It foreshadowed modern targeted operations where the most critical asset is not a bomb but a schedule, not a weapon but a location, not brute force but certainty. Still, that certainty is never absolute. Even in this case, the operation depended on assumptions: that Yamamoto would fly as planned, that the weather would allow contact, that the Americans would navigate accurately, that Japanese radar and observers would not detect the low-level approach, that the P-38 seconds would not suffer mechanical issues mid-ocean. It worked. But it worked on a knife edge. And there is another uncomfortable layer that historians and professionals alike wrestle with. When you target a person, you are not just destroying an asset. You are choosing a human being as the center of gravity. In total war, such choices become normalized. Yet the moral weight does not disappear. It simply becomes quieter. Was Yamamoto a lawful military target? Yes. By any conventional definition of wartime combat operations, he was a uniformed commander traveling in military aircraft within an active theater. But was it assassination in the psychological sense, killing a man, rather than defeating an enemy formation? The debate is less about legality and more about how warfare evolves when intelligence makes individuals vulnerable. Because once you prove that a commander can be plucked from the sky, you are not just changing one battle, You are changing how leaders move, how they communicate, and how they think. You inject fear and caution into the bloodstream of command. Operation Vengeance did not end the war. It did not erase Japan's remaining strength, but it did something subtler and, in some ways, more enduring. It showed that the Pacific War was no longer just a contest of fleets and islands. It was also a contest of codebreakers, analysts, navigation tables, fuel calculations, and decisions made in quiet rooms far from the sound of guns. The bullet that killed Yamamoto was fired from a fighter aircraft, but the killing blow began much earlier, in the silent work of people who never saw the target, people who turned numbers into meaning, meaning into a map, and a map into a dead man's route. Operation Vengeance remains one of the most surgically planned strikes of World War II, a mission where intelligence and aviation met with ruthless timing. Yamamoto's death delivered a psychological shock and removed a singular figure from Japan's naval leadership, but it also exposed a new truth about modern war. Once information becomes precise enough, distance stops being protection, and that leaves a final question worth sitting with. When a war allows you to kill a commander on a timetable, does it make conflict more efficient or simply more cold, more personal, and harder to escape? Prompt WW2.